Hi, this is Marco Williams from PlayFab, and this is a continuation of our authentication series. Now let's take a look at what the PlayFab Authentication service actually does behind the scenes. So here we've defined out our events. These are just standard C# events. We define a delegate and define the event that you can subscribe to. We have some fields that we need to populate with information. So I have an email, a username, and a password field. This auth ticket is here because we will be using that for Facebook and Google, but right now we're not using that in this example. Here we have the info request params, so we're passing that into our auth service because when we authenticate, we need to send those parameters with our API calls. We have a force link flag. This was basically for debugging because as I was showing this over and over again, I needed to be able to unlink from devices, and I'll explain what that means. Here we have some accessibility for our PlayFab ID. So this identifies the player. When you log in with any of our API calls, it will create a PlayFab ID and return that back to you. And then you can use that to identify your player. And then also a session ticket. And that there are several other API calls that we're not going to cover today that would utilize that. Then we have some, constants for things that we store in player prefs. So yeah, in this particular case, authentication player prefs is actually a really good way to store a little bit of information about how that user logs into your game after they've done it the first time. So we're storing if they chose to remember me or not. We're storing what their last type of authentication was. So once they've logged in, the next time that they log in, we can auto detect that and actually just log them in without prompting them for the UI. You'll notice that part of the first steps that we had here was to authenticate. So in the start, the last step here was authenticate. And if we look at what authenticate does in our service, it's just trying to log them in with the appropriate auth type. And since in the beginning we set the auth type to none because there is no auth type, when it first tries to pick that out, there's no auth type, it's going to be set to none. And then it will prompt the user with our on display authentication. But if you've already set it to silent, then it will just silently log them in, which is really nice. So based off of the different types of authentication, it's going to do, one of these type of things. And then here we're just storing that auth type inside of player prefs. Again, we're storing their remember me ID. Now, this is a very unique scenario, which we'll go into more detail either later in this video or in another video. But in short, we need to generate some way to identify the user if they've used a username and password. So if they said, I want to remember me, we don't want to store their password locally on their client and log them in with their own password every time. Instead, we have a better recommendation for how to handle that scenario. We have some helper function here just to clear out the player prefs if you want to choose to not remember the user after they've already chosen to remember them. And then this authenticate is the override where we can specify the auth type and then it will call your authentication method. So that's kind of the primary state machine that is set up. So this authentication method plus the auth type being stored in player prefs is kind of your state machine of how the player authenticates. The actual calls to PlayFab are very simple, and we're going to jump into that right now. I'm going to start with silent authentication here, and you'll see that I have some preprocessor directives. And if I were to come in here and go build settings, and I'm going to switch my project to Android real quick. So now we've switched our project to Android, and if I come into Visual Studio and I just comment out this editor portion. So let's examine silently authenticating a little closer, specifically for Android, because iOS is a little more simplistic, and logging in on a PC is also more simplistic. But for Android, we need to get a device ID. Now, using system info device unique identifier won't really do here for Android. So what we are doing instead is we are going natively to Android, and we're actually requesting that the native Android device ID. And this is the device ID that you want to pass. Now, this code is a copy and paste literally from a Stack Overflow. So if I go to Google and I type in Unity device ID Android, this very first post here, oh, it's not actually in Stack Overflow, it's in Answers Unity 3D Forms. So let's click here, this very first post. You're gonna scroll down, and I literally copied and pasted this code. This is a great reply. It definitely is the best answer, and it works every single time. So I copy and pasted that right here. I did change the variable name to device ID, and so now we can actually utilize the PlayFab APIs. Now, PlayFab APIs are very simple. You basically have a request object, a result, some sort of a result callback, and an error callback. And so here we are actually defining out our request object. Now I could take that and I could make it its own object. So I could say var, var request equals, and then now I've created my own object here. I copied one, too many parentheses. And then I could just pass this request object here. In this particular service class, I'm doing everything inline. So just so that you understand the syntax here, you can just define these objects separately. So like I was saying, every API call in PlayFab functions the same way. So you're calling off of our PlayFab client API, the method, you're passing it some sort of a request, you're going to get a callback and an error callback. And so here we are defining our request is log in with an Android device ID, and we're utilizing the login with Android device ID. Now we want to do this. It's so important that when you're logging in on an Android device that you log in with the Android device ID API, because this is what sets the origin for the player. So if I were to go to my PlayFab account and I look up one of these players here, you'll see the origination for that. I don't know why it's showing Australia. Oh, I'm logged into a VPN. That's why. So if we look at that, the player, the origination, because I'm logging in through the Unity editor, the login is going to be unknown because it's going to pick up a custom ID. We'll get into that in a second. But if you're logging in on an Android device, it's going to show you logging in from an Android device here. And so your origination is actually going to be Android. And that is important because when you later learn in PlayFab about segmentation, this allows you to segment your players based off of their origination. So I'm going to continue on. We are passing in our title ID, setting up your title. You just register for PlayFab and you create a game, it'll give you your title ID. When you use editor extensions inside of Unity, this is not really part of this video, but under the settings tab, you can select your studio and your title ID. So we're passing that along with this API. We're passing the device model for the Android device, the operating system, and the device ID. And then we set this create account flag to true so that if this is the first time that they've ever logged in, then it's just going to create their account for them. And if it's the second time or further on, it will be just using the same account. We're also sending the info request params, and that tells PlayFab send back more data about the user. And that's defined out inside of our login window right here. You can say, oh, well, give me the user's inventory and the user's virtual currency along with the login request. And that means that you don't have to re-query for that information when the player logs in. Continuing on, we have a couple variables that provide accessibility to the PlayFab ID and the session, and I'm just grabbing those and I'm storing them in those variables. And then each of our APIs need to report back to what the status of their login was. So here I'm checking to see if we're internally calling the callback, or if we're sending this back to the subscriber for on login success. And so if this was not like internally called, then we're going ahead and invoking our success callback, and we're going to pass it the result that we got back from PlayFab. And if we look here, the result has this info request payload, and inside of that is defined all of the things that you've specified that you want back with this user. And then on error, we're again just reporting this back to the user. And that is really how any of our authentication methods are called. So this example is not only just showing you how to make API calls. This example is about flow. And we want to make sure that you're implementing the best practices for authentication flow. So our flow right now is, when you authenticate silently, we are recommending that you do it specific for these different platforms. So if they are on Android, we are using the login with Android device ID call. If it is an iPhone, then you're using login with iOS device ID. And here, if I comment out the editor portion, oh, well, let's do this. Unity editor. You'll see that for iOS, I'm just passing the system info.device unique identifier. This is actually good enough to use, and it's consistent enough to use on an iOS device. Let's put this back. Everything else that we're doing here is exactly the same thing that we are doing in the callback structure and error handling for each of these methods. So that way your authentication across different platforms behaves the exact same way. For desktop, silent authentication on desktops, there are two things, and one of them I don't actually have in this example. If you are just building a desktop app and you're releasing it for download on your own website or some other distribution channels, then this is the way that you would want to do this. So you would have login with a custom ID. We're using the device unique identifier that we're passing along. The rest of this callback structure and error handling is the exact same way as all of the other ones. However, if you were, let's say, using a distribution platform like Steam, then we would want to add a whole new condition here. If we go back up to our supported auth types, all the way at the top, we would want to add in Steam here, and then we would want to place a new condition inside of our case statement. And we would want to make a new method let's see, where do I want to put it? I'll just put it right here. Private void authenticate Steam. And then we would, well, I'm not going to go into the full details of Steam because that is another video, but this is how we can add different authentication types. So we would want to use the PlayFab API login with Steam, which you can see here on our documentation website. We can go to Client API, and underneath the account management section, we have all the different ways that you can authenticate. So we go to, login, there it is. Oh, it was under the authentication. Actually, I need to change this link. So here we have all the different ways that you can authenticate, and one of them is login with Steam. And if we look at login with Steam, it's going to require the Steam ticket for creating an account. And so there's a whole flow around that we will cover in that video. So I think that kind of wraps up what we have built so far. This current auth flow gives us the ability to log in anonymously. It gives us the ability to log in with an email and a password or register a new user. And you'll notice that I didn't use the register with PlayFab. What I did, before we wrap here, I wanted to kind of point out one thing on the registration flow is that when we log in with an email address and password, if it sends back our account not found, so we were handling that in our errors, where is it? Account not found, and then they call to register, so that's going to take us into, actually, I'm moving kind of quickly here, into our register PlayFab account, and that's going to call add account and password. If I go to the definition here, what you're going to notice that we do here a little bit differently, and this is also part of Authentication Flow and best practices, is we silently authenticate them with whatever device type that they have previously authenticated with. So we're saying silently authenticate your user so we get their origin, which means that you can do all your segmentation. And then once they're already logged in, then we're just going to add the username and password to that existing account. The benefit of doing it this way is it really cuts down on the amount of account abandonment that you end up with in the authentication flow. It's very easy to create new authentications for players, and then all of a sudden they choose to authenticate with Facebook or authenticate with some other means, and you just call those login with authentication instead of link with authentication, and now you have an account abandonment issue, and the player will lose things that they had on one account. That results in a customer service nightmare, and we're trying to prevent that. This is the same situation. Here, we are essentially linking a username and password to that already existing account that they've already created, and that's the recommended flow. So again, we've got login and registration. We have play as a guest or silent authentication. Our next video series is going to be login with Facebook. And then we're going to do a separate video for login with Google. and then a third video, which we will add a whole new method here, which would be logging in with Steam. Thanks for watching.